Good afternoon and welcome to an informational briefing from the Senate and House Committees on Housing. I'd like to welcome our co-chair, Representative Troy Hashimoto, and if you'd like to introduce your members.
Thank you, Senator. We have Rep. Martin here and Rep. Evslin. Thanks for being here. Thank you, Senator.
Okay, so we're convening an informational briefing, the 1 p.m. agenda, with a presentation from Greg Goldberg, the Director of U.S. Municipal Finance at RBC Capital Markets, all the way from Denver, and he's joined by his colleague Tom Yang, all the way from California. The purpose of this informational briefing is to understand strategies for accessing capital markets in order to better leverage funds for housing development. And I'm personally very excited. I was put in touch with these two gentlemen by the new DHHL chair, who said that they would have a lot of interesting things to say, and they indeed do. So unfortunately, we have about 45 minutes, or we want to end around 1:45. We have 15 minutes to transition to the next hearing. I'll let you take it away.
Great, and I'm going to try to make my remarks brief. Thank you for having me, Senator Chang and Representative Hashimoto and all the members of the committee. I hope today's information that we can share will be valuable in some way, and hopefully there's a way to follow up and put some of my ideas into action. Anyway, I'm going to go very quickly through the first parts so that we can have some interaction within our allotted 45 minutes. I'm just really quick. I don't want to give a commercial on our firm, but I am proud to say that we are the 7th largest global financial firm. So we do bring some credibility and breadth to the mix. We've been the number 3 muni bond underwriter nationally for the last couple of years. And we have been very active in Hawaii. These are tombstones memorializing a number of transactions we've done here in Hawaii. And in my prior life at a different employer, I actually did several multifamily bond financings through HHFDC. I think every one that was offered in the public markets since the beginning or the middle of 2012. Part of a big practice of 18 other bankers across 7 offices. We perennially rank number 1 in multifamily housing banking, with the exception of 2021 when we were number 2 in the market. There's a little more information about some of the executions that we do, but we're particularly proud of what we do in Hawaii. We actually have an equity investing team that syndicates low-income housing tax credits and energy tax credits. This slide here shows a sampling of what we've done, and we have more in the pipeline. Not going to go into great detail, but one transaction that we're very proud of has nothing to do with housing, but it is related to housing. Is we did finance the world's 2nd or 3rd largest battery for HECO to capture solar power during the day that can be distributed at night. And I'm going to skip through that pretty quick because that's not really the topic of the day. Another project, though, that we were excited about was a student housing project for the University of Hawaii. The Atherton Residential Life Innovation and Entrepreneurship Center is an example of a 501c3 not-for-profit financing, which is a technique that we can bring to Hawaii to stretch the ability to bond finance projects beyond the limits of private activity bond cap. And that is related to bond cap recycling, which is a topic that I didn't cover in the presentation, but I was actually at a meeting with HHFDC in the city and county of Honolulu earlier, and they asked me to bring that up because it is an important way to stretch the capacity and the resources of the state beyond what is being done now. So we'd be happy to talk about bond cap recycling and certain initiatives that could be passed by the legislature to make sure that that can happen. And just a couple of case studies, a couple of projects that we've financed equity-wise, both here on Oahu. I'm going to flip through those pretty quick and get back to deployment strategies, which really is the topic at hand. This conversation was really started with a conversation with Cully Watson, who is the new head of DHHL. And our understanding is that DHHL has a significant sum of money that they've been allocated by the legislature to support housing for Native Hawaiians. And so the question is, how to best take advantage of that pot of money. And we would argue that at least a portion of that could be best used by leveraging it and creating a fund, essentially a revolving fund, separate from the rental housing revolving fund that's administered by HHFDC. This would be separate and apart from that. And instead it would essentially involve capitalizing the fund with some chunk of money, whether it's part of DHHL's current allocation or some additional chunk of money that would be allocated by the legislature to a different state agency. And it could then use that to support loans. And rather than just spending the money and giving it out to support projects on a one-to-one basis, that project, if it was used as collateral for a loan fund and rated by the rating agencies, could potentially sell bonds in multiples of the corpus of the fund. So if you just use an example of $200 million, if that was what was allocated, that could potentially finance 4 $50 million projects. However, with leverage, if you did 2 times leverage, that could be used to finance 8 $50 million projects. And the $200 million would be used as additional collateral. Bonds would be issued to support each of those projects, whether they're taxable or tax exempt, would maximize the amount of good that could be done with those funds. Now, with that comes some constraints. You would need to carefully analyze whatever group is administering these funds would have to carefully underwrite each project to make sure that it did have the capability of prepaying the money that it borrowed with some debt service coverage and with a margin for error, and that rents and expenses were all underwritten properly. There's a wide variety of scenarios that you could imagine in terms of what levels of rents and so forth that the fund could support. But needless to say, it could be flexibly designed to meet the needs of the people of Hawaii, and could be leveraged multiple times. Perhaps certainly 2 times, perhaps up to 3 or 4 times. And the ultimate answer is sort of a function of what are the needs of the state, and also you'll be working with the rating agencies to come up with a rating on that fund, hopefully of investment grade, to create the lowest possible cost of capital. The beauty of that is as projects repay their debt, which would be at a markup to the fund's cost of capital, that would essentially create a snowball effect and create additional capital that could be deployed to future projects. And these projects could take the form of projects using recycled private activity bond cap. They could be done by not-for-profits, or they could potentially be owned by a different governmental entity, as long as the revenues were pledged to repay that. And again, this all has to be done on a business-like manner with constraints consistent with the rating agency requirements to maintain financial strength going forward. So it will involve a little bit of state staff to review the projects and monitor them over time and administer the fund, but there'll be some revenue associated with it, so it should be ultimately very helpful. As I said, as projects repay their loans, those funds go back into the fund to be redeployed later. Some other suggestions I have is, there are federal infrastructure funds that came out in the Jobs Act of 2020, I think it was, or 2020, maybe it was earlier this year, I forget, 22. And there are various subsidies for both transportation, internet service, water and sewer, energy things, and that could be particularly useful in subsidizing the development of some of DHHL's land, which I know much of which is located in rural areas that don't necessarily have a lot of resources. Another resource that can be used to plug those gaps is the similar rental housing revolving fund that's run by HHFDC. that provides equity-like money to help get projects off the ground, because some projects, won't be able to support 100% debt financing. That is, an important resource to getting things done. Other examples that we've seen to leverage funds and get projects done, we've seen in other states, large employers such as Amazon, Microsoft, and Apple have in their home states and where they have a significant base, chosen to support housing in a big way, letting their resources to create additional housing. And, there may be large employers in Hawaii that could make a similar commitment. This is a simple diagram of what a revolving fund would look like. Ultimately, the key here is that the funding that comes from the state or other resources, if they're available, potentially federal resources, other types of grants, are essentially the orange box on the upper left. That all gets contributed into a fund, which is then used to secure loans. And those loans are basically funded by bonds sold to the public. And eventually, when the projects repay the funds, that will come back into the revolving fund and grow the kitty to make more loans in the future. And so, you would work closely with the rating agencies to kind of figure out what your loan capacity would be. But I think, needless to say, it would definitely let you leverage the amount that's allocated. This financing strategy is used by, certain housing finance agencies across the country, along with, water and sewer bonds and other utility districts across the country. So, it's definitely not breaking new ground, but it's been used a little bit less by housing outside the state HFAs. Some of the key considerations that you want to keep in mind as you consider if this idea is appropriate for the state to pursue. You have to figure out if the support is, strictly a one-time allocation of funds, or if there's some additional funds that can be supported in the future. Obviously, future funding commitments are maybe a little more challenging to make, but they could certainly grow the size of the fund, and it is an important project. And you obviously have to consider, what type of projects you want to finance, who the recipients might be, and how to define who's eligible. Obviously, broader participation is probably encouraged, because the low-income housing tax credit program takes care of folks who are very low and extremely low income. Market rate people can take care of themselves, but the middle income segment of the population that are working in essential functions often have a hard time affording safe and reasonable housing. Obviously, you'll have to target a desired credit rating and kind of make sure you can adjust your cost of capital for the fund with what you can provide to the projects. And obviously, those projects need to be underwritten, so you need to develop strict criteria to make sure that the loans can be repaid, taking into account the creditworthiness of the project and other resources that the borrowing entity can bring. And again, those can take many different forms. And obviously, there's got to be an allocation process to see how those funds would be allocated and divvied up. But I think it's safe to say there'd probably be more demand than funds available in almost any scenario. You'd have to work with the rating agency to set up certain pool parameters in terms of how large a project you could finance, what the level of diversity amongst the projects would be, because you don't want your credit risk concentrated in one particular place, and all of the details that go into making a loan. And so there's numerous compliance requirements as well that govern the issuance of bonds that all need to be taken into account. Certainly your bond counsel and attorney general can help you navigate those along with your financing partners. The equity funds can be leveraged somewhere between 2 and 4 times, depending on how things that work with how it fits in with the rating agency's criteria. And there obviously is a trade-off between the rating and the cost of funds and how much you can do with the funds. So it's to your advantage to have the highest possible rating to make sure that your cost of funds is as low as possible to do the most good. And again, I've mentioned this a few times, but it's very critical is the loans have to be made sure to be financially feasible. You need these loans to be repaid. Otherwise, it would become a bit of a debacle. You can do this either on a taxable or tax exempt basis using a variety of ownership structures of the underlying projects. And it allows the state to be pretty creative in projects that it funds and the resources that it provides. And obviously this is a pretty broad program, so it will require specific legislative guidance to implement. I know that the folks that implement these type of programs look for specific instructions on how to implement it, and so that would be helpful to provide guidance to do that. This is an example of a program that's widely used nationally. It's, as I mentioned, wastewater and drinking water revolving funds are done in 30 states. Their forms of this are basically used by state HFAs as well to finance housing, both single and multifamily. And then, of course, we have pooled loans to meet infrastructure, both water and other types of infrastructure projects. And then some states have their own state infrastructure banks to manage this whole process for a wide variety of projects across their states. And so with that, jumping back just to show the breadth and diversity of these type of programs, these are just a small smattering of the deals that we're involved in, and it's not intended to be a commercial, but it is intended to show that this type of program does work nationwide, and it's been used frequently. And again, as you're developing your language and debating this potential solution as one of an array of tools, you want to figure out how to deploy this capital in the most efficient way. And so that could be a division between both new sites with infrastructure in place and other sites that the state controls the land but still needs infrastructure. And in general, I know this is a topic that people have different views on, but generally multifamily complexes will more efficiently provide housing in terms of cost to more people than will single family residences. So there is a trade-off. I'm sure most people would prefer to have a single family house with a big yard, but economically and ecologically, I'm not sure that's entirely possible. And I would also suggest that the program would be set up to work with both the for-profit and not-for-profit local partners here who have additional capital they can bring to transactions, as well as a lot of technical expertise in building these projects. And so I think they can definitely help get things done by leveraging their skills and resources and pipelines. Many of them have sites already to go, just looking for a way to get transactions done. One good resource would be, shovel-ready projects that had perhaps applied for an allocation of low-income housing tax credits, or the private activity bonds that go with the 4% low-income housing tax credits. Many of those projects are kind of ready to go, but for the resources to finance them. I'd also point out that acquiring existing assets is much quicker than building a new project. So to the extent that there's any projects available in the market for sale, those could be an excellent opportunity to put this money to work pretty quickly. And then obviously you'll have to take into account, the mixed income nature and mixed population of the workforce. There's different theories on how that should be done, but many of these techniques can lead to a mixed income population where there's not necessarily a lot of guidance from the IRS on how that has to be allocated. particularly essential function bonds, which is another topic that I could go into for hours at a time. And then, the other issue, especially in an island state like Hawaii, you probably don't want to deploy all this capital all at one time with the limited resources of the contracting community. Doing a bunch of simultaneous projects might be challenging and sort of drive up the cost. So, you want to ease it in over a number of years. And I've got a few case studies that I could share as well. I'll go through those very quickly and then maybe turn it over to a question and answer forum because I do want this to be interactive. But an example of using recycled bonds to finance projects is a deal that we closed with the California Municipal Finance Authority 2 weeks ago. Created 369 new units of housing in Los Angeles in the San Fernando Valley with basically no public resources, a private developer funded equity, and the balance of the funding was provided by tax exempt bonds. I won't go into the structure of that and how we created the most efficient cost of capital, but suffice it to say that was 369 units created out of thin air and some borrowers' equity and knowledge. Pacific Oaks Senior Apartments was a different type of transaction. It was done with a 501c3 not-for-profit in California. This was essentially a refinancing to buy out a partner and preserve the long-term affordability of this particular project. There is a huge demand amongst investors for bonds to support projects like this, and 501c3s have essentially unlimited access to access bonds within their mission. And so the state of Hawaii currently does not allow 501c3s to be financed. So there haven't been very many deals done here. However, we can work with some of the multiple state issuers that exist that can do bonds in do bond issues in any state, and we can bring them here. Although I guess I would strongly suggest that you consider changing that rule to enable the state entities here in Hawaii to finance 501c3 bonds itself. But until then, there's other resources we can bring in. I'm going to skip over these last couple of projects, which are essential function housing bonds, governmental owned projects that also might be of interest. But in the interest of time, we don't have a whole lot of time left. I'm going to stop talking and invite questions.
Thank you so much for that great presentation. I mean, I don't know that I followed everything exactly, but it sounds like we can take $1 and turn it into $5 basically, and that $5 will be cheaper than $5 in the private markets, which is what enables the creation of low-cost housing at a much reduced impact to the taxpayer. And is that a fairly accurate summary of what we've talked about?
Yeah, 5 times leverage might be a little bit optimistic, but certainly you can leverage at a multiple of 2 to 4 times at least, maybe more over time, especially. And it is a low-cost way of financing these projects, which are so costly to build and so in demand.
Josh, do you want to?
Yeah, I guess when you talk about leveraging funds and creating a guarantee fund, so what is the basic difference than what we have now, right? We have a rental housing revolving fund, of a dwelling unit revolving fund. What are you proposing for us to do it? I think you said you do a DHHL example. So I'm just trying to figure out what is it new that we're trying to accomplish with this new fund?
Well, as I understand it, and I'm not an ultimate expert in this, but the rental housing revolving fund essentially takes tax revenue in and then lends it directly out to projects on essentially a 1-for-1 basis. And so, to the extent that you take in $10 of tax revenue, then there's a loan made with $10 of that tax revenue and paid back over many years. What I'm proposing instead of taking that $10 and giving it out would be leveraging it, which would require setting up this fund and administering it, working with the rating agencies, to raise additional capital. And so suddenly, under that structure, instead of having $10 to supply, you could have the potential of providing, 20 or 30 or $40 to deserving projects. And so in that way, it multiplies the benefit of the fund.
So what is the strategy of that then? Is that in a combination of using other things like recycled PABs, 501c3 bonds? Like how are we, I'm just trying to get my grasp how we're actually functionally doing something different.
Sure. And there's a lot of creativity.
Right.
You can also use taxable financing with that structure. And by having the rating on the fund, that'll bring your cost of capital down substantially versus, just borrowing money on the open market by an investor from a borrower that's not got a credit rating. This fund could support 501c3s or recycled bonds or other types of projects. There's also an ability to do essential function projects that are owned by a governmental entity, much like the JPA projects were done in California with a few tweaks. I think that could be helpful here in Hawaii as well.
Okay. Well, I guess what I'm trying to figure out, because so when we're using rental housing revolving fund, obviously it's in a capital stack, right? We're using LIHTC and we're trying to leverage all of that. So I'm just trying to figure out getting down to the bottom, what is different from what we have now? I guess I'm just not grasping how you're going to make $1 turn into $3 without other things that we're going to leverage.
Yeah, it certainly isn't a panacea on its own. So it would have to be used probably in combination with things like the rental housing revolving fund or DERF monies or, CDBG grants, things like that. But it's just an additional tool to bring additional capital into the market. And in particular, some of those resources, the way they're used now, are mostly in the LIHTC program. But the LIHTC program is very constrained in terms of the availability of those resources from the federal government allocated out to the states. And so this would potentially allow you to do much more financing.
So is the recommendation not to just expand the use of the rental housing revolving fund? You would rather us make a new fund?
That's sort of what we were thinking, and this emanated from a conversation with regard to DHHL and how they're going to spend its money. And I know there's a lot of different thoughts on how best to do that, but a portion of that could be used in this way to leverage and expand the amount of financing that can be done with what is ultimately a limited resource.
Okay. Members, do you have any questions about this? Go ahead.
Yeah, you have a slide here referencing CW SRFs and how to leverage that money. Could you kind of walk through how other municipalities have leveraged CW SRF funds through a bond? Or even just if you could point us in the direction of a state that's doing it well and we can look into it more.
There's a ton of, the water revolving funds being used across the country. It's not an exact example because a water utility has the ability to charge rates on water and raise its revenue and has a lot of control, whereas a housing project, relies on its tenants to pay the rent. And so you need to, carefully underwrite the project. So I would say a multifamily housing project is much riskier than a water district or something like that. But at the same time, that basic construct is used by HFAs across the country.
And so, as far as specific examples, are they leveraging CDBSRF funds to do sewer expansion? And part of what's happening in Hawaii, I think, is that we're underutilizing CWSRF money, and I'm interested to hear more on how those funds can be leveraged, or just where to look to for sort of case studies on how those funds have been leveraged.
I guess we could follow up separately. I'm a housing banker, so I'm borrowing an idea, using leveraging ideas with some of my colleagues, but we have other colleagues that do this day in and day out, just like I do housing.
Okay,
And so we could certainly explore that topic at your leisure.
great. Thank you.
Members, any other questions? Oh, Vice Chair, go ahead.
Why don't you walk me through just this first case study on the Pacifico Senior Apartment? So
Actually, why don't you do the other
Okay.
one, the
Yeah.
Topanga Canyon, because actually I'm curious about that.
okay, yeah, so I'm looking at the tax exempt in the transaction overview, the $125 million in par value unrated bonds, 3.812% net rate, and then the 7% mezzanine bond. Where does the leveraging, where is that in this equation?
So that's a separate transaction. That's just to show the, ability of the financial markets to buy bonds. That was a one-on-one case of using recycled private activity bonds to create a project where there was no new private activity bonds to do a LIHTC project. Right? And LIHTC, by the way, is low income housing tax credit. And so that was kind of a separate topic from the revolving fund that I'd recommend the state consider setting up a recycling program to be able to, utilize the bond cap that is paid back on its LIHTC projects that HHFDC and the city and county of Honolulu finance to provide, roughly a third of that bond cap can be recaptured and applied to new projects. And so, it wasn't a direct example of the revolving fund concept, but again, a project we were, proud of completing and, could be replicated in Hawaii to some extent.
So for this project, you're saying as the LIHTC funds get repaid, they're using that money to fund this?
Yeah,
Yes,
in that case, the private activity bonds, which are a very scarce and limited resource that are allocated and sort of fiercely fought over in terms of, the demand far exceeds supply. And so what I'm proposing is that when those bonds are repaid under tax law during the first 4 years, they can be preserved and then recycled towards new projects. So that's a separate topic from the whole recycling fund or the revolving fund, excuse me, but is something that is worth consideration as a way to create new resources.
Sorry, wait, so is there an example here with recycling or no? Do you have a case study here that?
The Topanga and Canoga transaction was a recycling deal. I don't have an example of a revolving fund here.
Oh, okay. Okay. Sure, you guys know.
So when you recycle the private activity bonds, you can go out for LIHTC again as long as it's within that 4-year window.
No, that's a really great question. The recycled bonds do not come with low-income housing tax credits the second time.
Right.
So the second time you finance it, there's just no low-income housing tax credits.
Right. So it's just you. So in theory, what I was told is that would be a good candidate for probably 60% and above, or I guess 100% and below, right? Because I think what we were told is that in order for you to really use recycled private activity bonds, you need more incentive. So we had a tier 2 program, which was 100%, 60 to 100%. So that was, in that case, there was some incentive for them to do that type of, using the recycled PAB. But I think absent that incentive, we were told that maybe there would not be interest to use the PAB. What's your thoughts on that?
It really depends on the dynamics of the market and what those market rate units can be rented for. Again, those projects are colloquially known as 80-20 projects, right, with 20% at 20% at 50% AMI or 40% at 60, with no restriction on the rest. And so, to encourage those projects to get done and to have the market rate units marketed towards moderate income people, I think that's a good use of the rental housing revolving fund subsidy that's in place now, the tier 2 that you mentioned. And we've seen developers bring their own equity to the table, and there's no reason it couldn't be combined with other sources of subsidy, either national funds or CDBG funds or other things like that to create projects. But it does, motivate investors to bring their own private capital to the table, because under the private activity bond scenario, they get to enjoy the privileges and burdens of ownership. And to do that, these capitalist developers will bring capital to the table.
No, I think it's very interesting concepts. I think recycled private activity bonds is a relatively new thing that we're looking at. I think that's there's some potential there, but I think if we could do something like how you've explained it here for this particular project, where there is no subsidy, right? Inherent subsidy, like rental housing revolving fund, or I think that's what we're looking to get towards. It's just a matter of, can we do something that California did? And I'm just hoping we can. I don't know if the numbers exactly work out, but I think that's the ultimate goal. So if you're telling us that's the way we have to head, I think we're very interested in that.
Yeah, it's a complicated solution, but I think there is a path to doing that, and it just requires a lot of hard work and elbow grease to work through it.
Right. Members, any other questions, Senator?
Sure. If you don't mind, I think we had a few questions about how this actually works, and so I'm going to try to take my layperson's crack at it, maybe by looking at slide 16 and that diagram that you shared with us earlier. So maybe I'll try to explain my very limited understanding, and you can either correct me if I'm wrong, or you can explain it a little bit better than I can. So let's say the state were to take $100 million and to put it into a new fund. So that would be the top left orange box, would be 100 million state dollars. And so that goes into that follows that arrow down into that next orange box. And then it goes into, so we have $100 million, and we've worked with our underwriters, and we're going to start making loans, but we're not directly loaning out that $100 million. Rather,
each of those projects would then go to the market to finance bonds under the auspices of the program, whatever the program is called, this revolving fund, and issue new debt in the bond market, either on a tax exempt or taxable basis. And so that would all be set up to come back into the fund.
Okay, so the reason why, so if I were a developer, I could go out and do this myself without the state's involvement, but I would have to pay a higher interest rate than if this $100 million fund were to do the credit enhancement and guarantee the loan and say, essentially, if Stanley Chang Development goes bust, we, the state, are going to come in and help him pay.
That's right. Yeah, the fund should be, a higher credit rating than, Stanley Chang Development would be in your example. And so that should be able to get a lower cost of capital for that project. And all the funds that get repaid after the, part of the debt service will include a markup to the fund to grow that fund over time to enable it to do additional deals in the future.
Okay, so, so if Troy is that orange box, if Troy is the state, he's not actually giving me any money. He's just giving me a piece of paper that says he's guaranteeing my bond of whatever, $50 million. And so, but when my lender, like let's say RBC, issues that bond, I am repaying. Stanley Chang Development is repaying that bond, right? So no money has left Troy's coffers, right?
That's right. You would do a new capital markets transaction to, essentially raise money from bond investors to finance your project, and that would be used by the fund to make that loan to Stanley Chang Development, and then the fund would, be monitoring and hopefully never have to step up and make good on it. Hopefully, no money would ever leave the fund. It would actually be on hand in the fund, invested in some sort of a conservative portfolio investment, so that hopefully could be growing on its own as well.
So let's say after a few years, I've paid back half of the bond's debt service. So that in theory frees up more of the capital in Troy's $100 million pot of funds. And then that capital that get freed up, that in theory is guaranteeing my bond, he could then lend out to Mike IU development. Or he could, I guess, write a new piece of paper to Mike IU development that allows him to borrow up to $25 million in the private bond markets with the guarantee from Troy.
That's right. And, there'll be a kind of a size limit that you'll work out with the rating agencies, but exactly as you point out, as loans are repaid, that capital is able to be redeployed. There's also the credit migration of, your new project when it's a construction project and has yet to lease up, probably has more risk in it than a project after 5 years and it's fully completed and fully tenanted and just, running along very smoothly. So over time, that the risk of that loan will decrease once the project's up and running. And so that will also tend to allow the fund to make additional loans as its portfolio gets more seasoned.
Okay, so so the money never leaves, in an ideal scenario, the money never leaves Troy's box.
Correct. Hopefully it does not leave the box, although it is available if there's some sort of a problem with the loan that the fund would pay the difference to the investors between what the project could pay, and they'd have all sorts of legal remedies to come in and implement receivership or foreclosure or whatever.
So let's say Troy has followed your advice and his fund is investment grade because he hasn't leveraged it too much. And let's say Stanley Chang Development, I don't know, do I have a rating typically? Or
Most developers do not have.
So I have an unrated. So if I were to go on my own into the private bond markets and borrow money, what interest rate would I be expecting to pay?
You'd be you'd be in the unrated market. So you'd be in today's market, maybe call it a coupon with a 6%, starting with a 6.
Okay, and if I have that piece of paper from Troy, how much am I going to pay?
In Troy's investment grade rated fund, you might be, call it 4.5, 4.25.
So I basically get a discount of 1.5 points.
Something like that.
And then how much does that translate into? Like, what's a discount on the, I don't know, the monthly debt service or whatever that I'm paying to these bondholders with a 4.5% interest rate as opposed to a 6% interest rate?
Well, in that example, it's a 1.5%.
But in terms of dollars, like, what would that look like?
In terms of loan proceeds?
Like, if I have to pay $100,000 a month, and if I'm borrowing the money on my own as an unrated borrower, how much would I have to pay if I have Troy's piece of paper and I'm borrowing these bonds at 4.5 points?
It's just a function of math. So at that example, I think it's $75,000.
Okay, so then in theory, I can pass that savings of $25,000 on to the tenants of my new building. So I could knock their rent down 25%.
Not necessarily. It depends on how the project was funded. If you're an entrepreneur, Stanley Chang Development, would want to earn a return on whatever money it put in upfront, and so you probably wouldn't have put in whatever equity you put in at closing without having had that profit motive to earn some return off of it. Not that you're charging above market rents, but you would be, most developers would charge, similar rents as the market would bear.
Okay, so I would keep charging the same rent that I charged before. I would just make more money.
Potentially, but more likely you would get a bigger loan, given the lower debt service requirements. So there'd be less equity required. And, basically it would expand the amount of activity in the market.
I see. So you would see this really as enabling the creation of more housing as opposed to reducing the rent for that housing that is created.
Correct. And, theoretically, in a macro level, there's a feedback loop. There's the more housing there is, that'll tend to keep down the cost of housing, but that's that's on a macro level. So an individual project is probably not going to choose to keep its rents that low.
Right. So, but insofar as high interest rates are one of the barriers to the creation of affordable housing, this would reduce or remove that significant barrier.
It would certainly help.
Any other questions?
Yeah, a few more off of Stanley Chang Investing. Yeah, developer. So I'm a little bit confused. Why does the legislature need to even fund the 100 million in the first place? What's the point of that?
So with no financial strength backing the revolving fund that I mentioned, there's no way to get an investment grade rating. And if it was, just starting from scratch, there's really no lower cost of capital available because it has no financial strength.
Since we were talking about that, so you can't use the faith and credit of the state government then?
You could if the state was willing to put the full faith and credit of the state's finances behind it. Absolutely, you could.
Because at a certain point, it doesn't make sense to just throw money into a fund and you just let it sit there when it's not typically may not be used, right?
Sure.
So is that just as long as we pass a law saying we're going to insure loans? That's a possibility.
I think you could theoretically do that. I don't think we've seen that done often because it could create sort of a open-ended obligation on the.
No, but then we put a cap on it.
Sure.
Okay. So what's the difference between this and if you just allow for 501c3 bonds or allow for recycled PAB to start, right?
So they're different access to recycled private activity bonds and not-for-profit bonds are two techniques under the tax code. You can access tax exempt financing.
Right. But wouldn't that be better? Tax exempt financing?
Tax exempt financing is better in terms of it's a lower rate, although there are certain rules and requirements that come with that.
Yeah.
It could also, this fund idea could be used with taxable financing as well, which gives a lot more discretion and creativity.
Right.
To what you're financing, and the fund by itself is not taxable. It's going to be based on or tax exempt, I should say.
Right.
It's going to the tax exemption is going to be based on each particular project and its ownership structure.
Okay. Sorry, Vice Chair.
Yeah, and then my last question is, how does the developer fund the debt service prior to completion of the project?
Good question. That's ordinarily capitalized, so that's included as a line item in the budget. To calculate what's needed to pay the debt service from closing until it starts producing income.
Okay, thank you.
Mark, do you have anything?
So just to understand this, it's basically like LIHTC or anything. It's just a way to interest private developers to come in by making it slightly more profitable to do this kind of business.
Yeah, and maybe more profitable, maybe more feasible.
Yeah, more affordable for them to do a project. It's just another thing that we could add to.
It's a thing you could add, and I might also add that you'd be putting some requirements on it, so it wouldn't be the fanciest luxury apartments available in town that you're financing. You'd be limiting it to probably limiting it to a particular targeted group that needs help accessing housing or not. It really depends.
Yeah, just running off of Representative Ayu's question, if there were not $100 million sitting in a fund that could be leveraged, what the developer could proceed with a revenue bond based on the revenue from the project, and what would be some upsides or downsides from going that route?
Where there's no fund?
Yeah, if there was no fund, and because instead of like a GO bond or private activity bond based on some level of equity, couldn't they get a revenue bond from projected revenue from the project itself?
You can always issue bonds based on the projected revenue of a project.
Yeah.
There are certain requirements to make that a tax exempt bond. So you need that limited resource of private activity bonds,
Okay.
since it would be owned by a private developer. There's a separate category called essential function bonds that can be issued by the government, to finance its essential purpose of government, the same way schools are financed and roads. But that, doesn't have as big a role for the private developers.
So it's my understanding that at least on the mainland, revenue bonds are more common than here for funding development. Is that true or not? Revenue bonds assisted by the municipality, and
Revenue bonds in and of themselves, if it's going to be tax exempt, must be issued by an issuer as a conduit. So, it is possible to issue a taxable bond backed by a project with no governmental involvement, no tax exemption. But, when, the US Congress put these laws in place, it was intended to sort of limit the amount of projects that can be financed with private activity bonds. That's why the allocation.
okay, thank you.
Thanks. We want to thank you again for your informative presentation and for answering all of our questions. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have today. And so if members have further questions, they can reach out to you directly. And I know that we certainly intend to do so and look into some of the legislative suggestions that you've had for the state. We do need a few minutes to get ready for IT purposes for the 2 o'clock reso agenda. But this information briefing being, there being no further business in this information briefing is now adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.